Appalachian wool is garbage. It always has been. This flock's been garbage since before I had this job.
This is prime merino right here.
Vic Alderson held the fleece sample at arm's length, dangling it toward the room as if he were presenting evidence of something shameful. The raw fiber caught the morning light through the pool building's high windows, dense, almost cream-colored, warm with lanolin. He dropped it on the skirting table. The sound it made was soft. The room was not soft. The room went still the way rooms go still when something has been said that everyone heard and nobody quite wants to own. A wool grower near the scale stopped what he was doing. The two workers at the table looked at their hands. Amos Hale was 71 years old. He stood at his bagged lot with one hand resting on the top fleece, watching Vic the way a man watches weather he has watched before. No expression worth naming. No movement. He had been coming to the Floyd County wool pool in April for 18 years, and for the last 6 he had heard some version of this speech, and he had never answered it once. Grade 5 again, Vic said, turning toward the scale worker. Same as last year, same as the year before. You want my honest advice, Amos? Sell the flock and put the land to hay. A younger grower named Dave Sutton caught Amos's eye from across the room. He looked away first, but what Vic Alderson didn't know, had never bothered to test, was that Amos Hale's wool graded at 18.7 micron. Fine enough for premium garment production in Boston. Fine enough that a heritage textile buyer named Claire Duvall had spent 8 months tracing a single unlabeled sample from a fiber fair to this farm in the Blue Ridge foothills. And Claire Duvall was in the parking lot right now, walking toward the pool building door with the certified fiber report in her folder. Do you know that feeling when you've been told for 6 years running that what you built isn't worth anything, and you've known for 34 years that they just weren't looking? Let's go back. Let's go back to 1989, to the afternoon Amos Hale came home to his grandfather's farm and looked at what the flock had become. The farm was 90 acres in Floyd County, Virginia, in the Blue Ridge foothills. Amos's grandfather had fenced it in 1939, running mixed stock through the Depression and the war years and into the post-war decades, adapting as farms do, a little of this, a little of that, always watching the markets. By the time he died in January of 1989, the flock was 60 sheep of mixed breeding, with no records and no plan, spread across the pastures in the easy way of livestock that has been kept without intention for a generation. Amos was 37 years old. He had been teaching agricultural science at the county high school for 12 years. He drove up from his house in town the day after the funeral and walked the fences and counted the sheep and stood in the barn for a long time looking at nothing in particular. He knew genetics. He taught a unit on it every spring, walking his students through Mendel's bees and then through cattle breed improvement, and then through the wool industry's long project of fiber refinement. He knew from that curriculum that the Rambouillet and the Merino breeds had been selected over centuries for exactly one purpose: fineness of fiber. He knew that fineness was measured in microns, the diameter of a single wool fiber, and that the garment grade threshold was 20 microns and below, and that most commercial American wool ran well above that number. He looked at the sheep in the barn. He could see, without instruments, that some of them had finer fleeces than others. His grandfather had not selected for this. It was residual genetics, coming through whatever Merino blood had drifted into the flock at some point in its unrecorded history. He decided to keep the farm. He decided to do it deliberately. He spent the following spring pulling the coarsest animals from the flock and selling them. He kept the finest 12 ewes and found 2 Rambui rams from a program in West Virginia that had been selected for sub-20 micron fiber. He bred that cross carefully, keeping records by ewe and year in a green ledger he bought at the farm supply in April. The first year's entries were tentative. He was estimating fiber quality by hand, by touch, because he did not yet own an instrument to measure it. But the estimates were written down. The discipline of writing them down was the point. He told no one what he was doing. It seemed, at the time, like the kind of project that would invite the wrong kind of opinion before it had a chance to speak for itself. He kept teaching. He drove out to the farm on weekends and in the evenings and in the summers, running the breeding program alongside his full-time job, making adjustments season by season. It was slow work. Genetics improvement in livestock is always slow. You are working across generations, and each generation takes a year, and the changes are incremental and cumulative and do not announce themselves. You could spend 15 years doing this, and from the outside it would look exactly the same as doing nothing. His neighbors noticed the sheep. They noticed them the way rural neighbors notice things, obliquely, in passing, without making a production of it. Once in a while, someone would ask about the flock, and he would say he was working on the fiber quality, and they would nod, and the conversation would move elsewhere. No one asked follow-up questions, because fine wool breeding in the Blue Ridge foothills was not something anyone had ever done, and therefore not something anyone had a frame of reference for asking about. He continued. In the fall of 2004, he ordered a portable wool micrometer from an agricultural equipment catalog. It arrived in a foam-lined case. The precision instrument of it incongruous in the farm supply box with its coffee ring on the cardboard. He calibrated it against the reference standard that came with it and went into the barn that evening. He pulled a fleece from one of his best ewes, a third-generation daughter of his original Rambouillet cross, selected twice for fineness. He sampled 5 points across the fleece and measured each one. Then he averaged the numbers. He wrote the average in the ledger, 18.9. He sat with that number for a long time. 18.9 was well within the garment grade range. It was comparable to wool being produced by fine wool operations in Montana and Wyoming, operations that commanded premium prices from specialty mills. It was, according to his own curriculum materials from his teaching unit on wool quality, the kind of number that should not exist in an Appalachian flock. Not because Appalachian land was wrong for it, but because no one had tried to breed for it here. He had tried. And the number said it had worked. He drove to the county wool pool the following April for the first time. Vic Alderson graded his lot at grade 5, the lowest classification, without testing. The pool price for grade 5 was $1.10 per pound that year. He loaded his lot back into the truck and drove home and made a note in the ledger. He made the same drive and made the same note for the next 6 years. Vic Alderson had been the county wool broker since 2005, taking over from a man named Lou Reams, who had done the job for 20 years before him. Vic knew the wool market in the way of men who work a commodity business: prices, grades, volumes, buyer expectations. He knew what the regional pool could sell and at what price and to which buyers. What he did not know, had never needed to know for his purposes, was fine wool genetics. In Vic's mental model, Appalachian wool was commercial-grade fiber from commercial-grade breeds raised in hill country without the management intensity that specialty production required. This was accurate for 95% of what came through his pool. He applied it to the other 5% without looking closely enough to notice the difference. When he graded Amos's lot grade 5, he was not lying. He was not even technically wrong within his own system, because his grading protocol relied on visual and tactile assessment, not micronometry, and visual and tactile assessment of a fine wool fleece by someone who is not specifically trained to recognize fineness can produce exactly the result Vic produced. An incorrect grade applied with complete confidence. The problem was not that Vic was corrupt. The problem was that Vic had decided the conclusion before he looked at the evidence, and no one in Floyd County had the standing or the data to correct him. Amos had the data. He had 6 years of it in the green ledger, with micron readings running between 18.5 and 19.1. He could have put the ledger in front of Vic at any point. He chose not to. He was waiting for something he could not quite name. An outside confirmation, perhaps, or simply the patience that comes from being a man who has spent 30 years breeding toward a number and is willing to wait a little longer for the world to catch up to what he knows. The patience, it turned out, was the right call. At the April 2018 pool, a group of county extension agents attended as observers for a Virginia Department of Agriculture wool industry assessment. They walked the floor with clipboards, noting the grading process, the prices, the volume. Vic gave them a tour with the comfortable authority of a man who has been explaining things to observers for years. At Amos's lot, Vic made a pedagogical gesture of it. He pulled a fleece from the bag and held it up. "This is what happens," he said, to the agents and the room, when someone decides they know better than the market. Heritage breeds, fine wool genetics, none of it works in Appalachia. The buyers aren't here. The infrastructure isn't here. It's well-intentioned, but it's a garage project. One of the extension agents wrote something on her clipboard. She was a woman named Marcy Bright from the State Wool Program in Richmond, and she was writing, "Floyd County, possible fine wool operation, not graded correctly? Follow-up." She followed up 18 months later, when she submitted Amos's flock to the Virginia Sheep Producers Association's Fiber Fair in Richmond. The submission was unlabeled, as was the fair protocol. Claire Duval received it as Sample 3. The year after the extension agents visited the pool, Vic attended the Floyd County Farm Bureau spring meeting and made an informal recommendation. The recommendation was procedural and sounded reasonable. The fine wool classification in the Virginia grading guidelines should be retired from local pools, because there were no qualifying operations in the region and the category created confusion in the grading process. It was adopted without discussion, because no one in the room had reason to dispute it. Amos learned about it from Dave Sutton, who had been at the meeting and who came by the farm that same week. Dave was 34 years old and had been raising sheep himself for 7 years, commercial breeds, no fine wool ambitions, a practical young man with a practical operation. He had watched Vic grade Amos's lot for the past 3 years, and he had begun to have his own doubts. "He pulled the fine wool category," Dave said. "Said there's nothing in the county to qualify." Amos looked at him. "Just thought you should know," Dave said. "I appreciate it," Amos said. He drove Dave out to see the flock before he left. They walked along the fence line, and the sheep came toward them in the way of animals that know the person approaching. Amos pointed out 3 particular ewes, daughters of his best lines, the fiber running consistently below 19 micron, and Dave looked at the fleeces on them and said nothing for a moment. "They look different," Dave said. "They are different," Amos said. "Vic doesn't see it yet." Dave nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I believe in the flock." Amos did not answer in words. He watched the sheep. In the margin of the ledger that evening, under the entry for that week's check on the flock, he wrote, "Dz, believes in flock." It was the only personal note in 6 years of records. In the spring of 2020, Vic stopped at the farm on his broker rounds. He came into the yard with the careful politeness of a man delivering a difficult message, something Amos had seen him do twice before, once with a herd sell-off and once with a disease issue, and both times Vic had worn this same expression of reluctant duty. "Amos," he said, "I've been grading wool in this county for 15 years. I don't say what I say at the pool to be unkind. I say it because I've seen a dozen people try to run fine wool programs in this region, and none of them made it work. The land isn't right, the buyers aren't here, and the genetics don't hold the way they do in the West." Amos said, "Would you like a glass of water?" "I'm all right," Vic said. "What I'm saying is, if you want to keep the flock for personal reasons, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't build a business plan around it." "All right," Amos said. "I'm saying it for your benefit," Vic said. "I understand," Amos said. Vic drove away. Amos took the ledger out that evening and read the last 6 years of Micron entries. He thought about calling the Virginia Sheep Producers Association. He had thought about calling them before, several times, and had not. He picked up the phone this time. The person he reached told him the Fiber Fair submissions were open through the end of October. He said he would send a sample. At the April 2022 pool, 6 months before the Fiber Fair, Vic had 3 new growers in the room who had never seen the Hale flock before. He used it the way he had used it with the extension agents in 2018, as an illustration. This is what happens when someone doesn't align their breeding program to regional conditions, he said. He pulled a fleece from Amos's lot and stretched it between his hands. Looks good from the outside. Feels all right, but without commercial volume. Without the right breed for the right region. It's a personal project, not a business. He handed the fleece back to Amos. Amos received it with both hands and placed it gently back in the bag. His face showed nothing. His hands were careful and sure, the hands of a man who has handled 100,000 fleeces over 30 years and knows exactly how to hold one. One of the new growers asked Vic, "What does Micron certification cost?" Vic said, "It's not worth discussing for most Appalachian operations." Dave Sutton, standing across the room, watched this. He watched Vic hand the fleece back. He watched Amos's hands. He shook his head once, barely visible, then looked at the floor. The pool moved on. Claire Duval drove to Floyd County in February of 2023. She had been corresponding with Amos since November, when she had finally traced the Fiber Fair sample through 5 months of association records to his name. She had sent him a letter, a real letter, on mill stationery, explaining who she was and what she had found and what she wanted to discuss. He had written back the same week. Neat handwriting, 2 pages, precise and undemonstrative. He sent a December fleece sample with the letter. She tested it. 18.5. She drove down from Boston on a Thursday in February, in a car that was very clean for the kind of roads around Floyd County. She found the farm from his directions, the white mailbox, the lane running back to the farmhouse, the flock visible on the hillside in the gray February light, their dense fleeces making them look bigger than sheep usually look in winter. She and Amos talked for 4 hours at the kitchen table. He had the green ledger out and the micrometer and 8 years of testing records. She had her firm's quality standards documentation and the certified fiber report her lab had prepared. They went through everything methodically, the way two people go through things when they each have specific technical knowledge and are trying to map one onto the other. She proposed a direct purchase contract, $4.20 per pound, 3-year term, annual fiber certification required. He asked her to come to the pool in April. She looked at him across the kitchen table. Why the pool? He was quiet a moment. Then, because Vic should be there. She thought about this. All right, she said. April 15th, 8:30 in the morning. The Floyd County Wool Pool building, which smelled of lanolin and old wood, and the faint diesel note from the skirting table. Vic arrived at 8. He had his grading forms and his pool log and the practiced confidence of a man doing a job he knows well. By 8:20, he had processed 2 lots and was at Amos's when the door opened and Claire Duval walked in. She was 45, in practical clothes, carrying a leather folder. She looked around the room with the assessing calm of someone who has walked into a lot of rooms and quickly determined what matters in each one. She found Amos with her eyes. She crossed the floor to him. Vic looked up. "I'm Claire Duval," she said to Vic. "I'm a sourcing buyer from a heritage textile mill in Boston." "This is a county wool pool," Vic said, not rude. Informational. He genuinely was not sure why she was in the building. "I'm aware," Claire said. "I'm here about this lot." She put her folder on the skirting table and opened it. She took out the fiber report and set it on the table, directly on the spot where Vic had dropped Amos's fleece sample 40 minutes earlier. Vic looked at the report. He looked at the micron number at the top, which was printed in bold, 18.7. "What lot is this from?" he said. Claire pointed to the lot identification number in the report header. It matched Amos's lot number, which was written in Amos's hand on the tag that hung from the bag beside them. Vic picked up the report. He looked at the number again. He looked at the reference table at the bottom of the page, which specified the fine wool garment threshold as 20 microns or less. He looked at 18.7. He put the report back on the table. "How long has this program been running?" Claire asked. She asked it toward Vic, but it was Amos who answered. 34 years, Amos said. The room was very quiet. The pool workers had stopped their work. Dave Sutton, who had arrived for his own lot that morning, stood with his arms crossed. 3 other growers, who had been waiting near the back wall, were looking at the skirting table. Vic did not say anything. His face had gone still. Not pale, exactly, but something had drained out of it. The certainty that had animated 18 years of grading decisions and Farm Bureau recommendations and gentle speeches about what worked in Appalachia and what didn't. He looked, in this moment, like a man who has been holding a position for a very long time and has just run out of ground to stand on. Outside, through the wall of the pool building, one of Amos's sheep moved in the holding pen. You could hear it. In the silence, you could hear it clearly. The contract was signed the following morning at Amos's kitchen table, $4.20 per pound, 3-year term, with annual fiber testing and a quality assurance clause. At the current lot volume, 140 head, averaging 5 pounds of clean fleece per animal, the new contract rate put his annual income from the wool at approximately $2,940 more than Vic's pool rate. Over 3 years, with expected flock productivity, the difference came out to approximately $37,000 against what he would have received at pool prices. Marcy Bright, the extension agent who had submitted the fiber fair sample, received a phone call from Claire 2 days after the signing. She called the Virginia Sheep Producers Association's Quality Committee and reported the outcome. The committee met in June. In the spring of the following year, the fine wool classification that Vic had recommended removing was reinstated in the county pool grading guidelines, following a review of the Hale Flock's certified fiber data. Vic Alderson attended neither the committee meeting nor the pool the following April. The Virginia Sheep Producers Association invited Amos to present his breeding records at the fall conference in Roanoke. He drove down on a Thursday with the Green Ledger and 2 certified fiber reports and a photograph of the 3 ewes he considered his best lines. He spoke for 20 minutes without notes. The room was quiet in the way rooms are when people are paying attention. He answered questions for another 40 minutes. On the drive home, through the Blue Ridge, on a clear October afternoon, he thought about his grandfather, a man who had kept 60 mixed-breed sheep without records or a plan, out of the same stubbornness that kept Floyd County farmers farming in the first place. Amos had kept the flock for 34 years, selecting and recording and testing and writing the numbers down in the Green Ledger. And no one had looked. And then, someone looked. That was how it worked sometimes. You did the work, and you kept the records, and you waited for the world to catch up, and eventually it did, in the form of a woman from Boston with a certified fiber report and the specific vocabulary to make what you had built legible to the people who needed to understand it. He pulled into the farm lane at dusk. The flock was in the lower pasture, the sheep moving slowly toward the feed bunk in the fading light, their thick autumn fleeces catching the last of the day. He went into the barn. He took the fiber report out of his folder and tacked it to the barn wall beside the hook where the Green Ledger hung, the micron number facing out, readable from the door. 18-7, bold, clear 34 years in a number. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went inside to make dinner. There is something worth sitting with in Amos Hale's story, something that goes beyond the wool and the pool and the broker who wasn't looking. It's the question of what it costs to know something that no one around you will confirm. Amos knew the number. He had known it since the night he tested the first fleece by lamplight and wrote 18.9 in the ledger and sat with it for a long time. He knew it every April when Vic graded his lot at the bottom of the scale and drove away. He knew it when the fine wool category was removed from the pool guidelines, and when Vic made the pedagogical speech to the new growers, and when Vic stood in his yard and told him it wasn't worth building a business plan around. He kept breeding. He kept recording. He kept writing the numbers down. Not because he was certain the market would find him, he could not know that, but because the numbers were true. And the work was worth doing, and some things are worth doing at a loss for long enough that they stop being a loss. The fiber report did not create the value that was in Amos's wool. It made it legible. The value had been there for 34 years, in the genetics of 140 Rambouillet Merino crosses on 90 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills, written in the Green Ledger in careful handwriting, waiting for someone with the right instruments to read what Amos had already written. Vic Alderson had had the instruments. He had chosen not to use them. That choice had cost Amos, by rough calculation, somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000 over 6 years, in the gap between what his wool was worth and what the pool had paid him. It had also, in the end, cost Vic Alderson the certainty he had been living on for 18 years. You know this feeling, maybe not from wool or from livestock, but from something. From a time, you built something that no one around you could see the value of, and you kept building anyway, and waited for the right person to arrive with the right tools to make the value visible. That patience is its own kind of knowledge. It is not passive. It is the discipline of continuing to work carefully in the absence of external validation, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than it should be. Amos Sale had it. He kept it for 34 years. He keeps it still. If this story found something in you, the particular recognition of a man who knew what he had and waited for the world to catch up, subscribe and hit the bell, because we tell these stories every week. Old farms, long breeding programs, and the days when patience and records turned out to be exactly the right tools. Leave a comment telling us about something you built or kept or maintained that no one around you understood the value of, and whether the world ever caught up. We read every one. We'll see you next week. The grandfather's hands there was a morning Amos remembered that had nothing to do with micron readings or pool grades or anything measurable. He was 12 years old, and it was late March, and his grandfather had taken him into the barn before breakfast to help sort the winter fleeces. His grandfather's name was Earl Hale. He was a quiet man, heavy through the shoulders, with hands that had done every kind of farm work for 50 years. He did not explain things in words very often. He demonstrated them and expected you to watch. He showed Amos how to hold a fleece and feel the staple length, the way the fiber grew in tight defined bundles that you could pull apart slightly to see the length and the crimp. He showed him how to hold a handful of fiber up to the light from the small barn window. He showed him 2 fleeces from 2 different hues, one dense and fine, one looser and coarser, and had Amos run his fingers through both without saying anything. Then he asked, "Which one is better?" Amos picked the first one. His grandfather nodded. That was the whole lesson. There was no explanation of microns or garment grade standards or merino genetics. There was just a 12-year-old boy learning, by touch and by light, what fineness felt like. When Amos bought the micrometer in 2004 and measured his first fleece at 18.9, he thought about that morning. He thought about his grandfather's hands. The number on the instrument confirmed what Earl Hale had taught him without instruments 50 years earlier. Some fiber was different. Some fiber was worth more. The knowledge was not new. Only the precision of the measurement was new. He sat with that for a long time. What the ledger showed, the green ledger, spiral-bound 50 pages, the cover faded from years of handling, ran from 1989 to the present. Each page covered one season. Each entry covered one ewe, date, age, breeding, micron estimate or reading, notes on condition, pool grade. In 1989, the estimates were rough. They were based on Amos's knowledge from his grandfather and from his teaching materials, without any instrument. He used words like fine and medium fine to classify his early entries. By 1995, he had read enough in the agricultural extension literature to refine his estimates. He was using a comparison method, pulling fiber samples from his flock and comparing them to reference samples he obtained from the West Virginia Wool Research Station during an agricultural teachers' conference. His estimates got sharper. The words became numbers. He wrote est, 19.2 and est, 18.8 in small, careful handwriting. By 2004, with the micrometer, the estimates became measurements. From that point forward, every entry had an instrument reading. He tested at least 20 animals per season, about 15% of the flock, and averaged the results for each animal tested. The pattern in those numbers across 19 years of micrometer readings was unmistakable. The flock had gotten finer. The average reading had moved from his first-year estimates in the low 20s down through the 19-point range in the mid-2000s and settled into the high 18s by the early 2010s. The direction was clear and consistent, which is what a selective breeding program is supposed to produce. He knew what he had. Across the same years, the pool grades recorded in the adjacent column never changed. Grade 5, every year, every lot. The gap between the two columns, between what the flock actually was and what Vic's system saw, grew wider year by year without Vic noticing. Because Vic was not looking at both columns. Vic was only looking at the wool through the lens of what he expected to find. Claire Duval had looked at the same wool through a different lens, through a portable mill micrometer at a fiber fair, on an unlabeled sample, with no expectation about what an Appalachian flock should produce. She had found 18.7. She had written "find this" in her notes. That was the difference. Not the fiber. The looking. Dave Sutton's testimony at the Roanoke conference, after Amos had finished his 20-minute presentation and fielded 40 minutes of questions, a woman from the Virginia Department of Agriculture's wool program asked whether anyone present had witnessed the Floyd County pool grading practices she had been reading about in the association's Quality Committee report. Dave Sutton, who had driven down from Floyd County for the day and was sitting in the back of the conference room, raised his hand. He walked to the front of the room. He was 35 years old, in his good clothes, with the compact posture of a man who spends most of his time outdoors. He talked for about 10 minutes. He talked about the pool, about having watched Vic grade Amos's lot for 5 years. About the pedagogical speech to the new growers. About the morning the fine wool category was removed. He talked about walking to Amos's truck afterward and saying what he said, which he told the room without embarrassment. I believed in the flock, he said. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it. I could see the fleeces looked different. I could feel they were different. But Vic's the broker, and the broker's supposed to know, and I didn't think I was in a position to say otherwise. He paused. I wish I had, he said. 6 years of grade 5, when the wool was worth premium prices, that's real money that didn't go to a man who deserved it. I could have gone to the extension service and asked them to test a sample. I knew about testing. I just didn't think it was my place. He sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment. The woman from the Department of Agriculture wrote in her notes. Amos, at the front of the room, looked at Dave and gave him the smallest nod. The same nod he had given June Hartley 400 miles west and 6 months earlier. The slight acknowledgement of one person who understood to another. Dave nodded back. The spring after the following April, Amos drove to the Floyd County wool pool with his lot for the 19th year. The fine wool classification was back in the grading guidelines. A new grader had been assigned to the pool, a woman named Therese Payne from the state wool program who had attended the Roanoke conference and who had a calibrated handheld micrometer in her kit. She tested 3 fleeces from Amos's lot while he watched. The readings came back 18.6, 18.8, and 18.4. She averaged them, 18.6. She wrote fine wool, premium grade on the grading sheet. The pool price for premium grade that year was $3.90 per pound. He was already under direct contract with Claire's Mill, so the pool price was academic. He was not bringing his primary crop to the pool. He was bringing a small secondary lot. The animals he had culled from the breeding program. But the grade mattered anyway. The grade meant the pool would now be paying his neighbors, who had fine wool potential, if any of them had it, what that fiber was worth. He drove home in the afternoon with the empty truck and the grading sheet on the seat beside him. He thought about the difference two things had made. An extension agent with a clipboard and a follow-up instinct, and a fiber fair with blind submission protocols. 2 points of contact between his flock and the people who could correctly identify what it was. Everything else had followed from those 2 moments of correct looking. He pulled into the farm. The flock was in the upper pasture, the fleeces already growing toward May shearing. He counted them from the truck window, a habit so old he did it without thinking. A quick census of the flock's presence, the comfort of the number being right. 140. All present. He got out of the truck and walked up to the barn and stood in the doorway and looked at the fiber report on the wall. The afternoon light came through the barn's west window and lay across it. 18,007. The number had not changed. The number was always going to be 18.7 for that lot, in that season, tested by that instrument. Facts do not change because no one is looking at them. That had been the point, the whole time. That had always been the point. The summer program that summer, Amos started something he had not planned. 3 young farmers from Floyd County came to the farm on separate occasions, 2 women and a man, all in their 20s, all with small flocks and questions about breeding for quality. Word had gotten around. The Roanoke Conference had put his name in a context that made him findable. He showed them the ledger. He showed them the micrometer and demonstrated how to use it. He walked them through the pasture and pointed out the ewes he had selected for the current season, explaining the traits he was looking for and why. He was not teaching a class. He was answering questions in the way of a man who has been asked real questions about something he knows. One of the women, a 28-year-old named Phoebe, who was running 30 mixed-breed sheep on a rented place near Hillsville, came back 3 times over the summer. She was serious and quick, and she asked the right questions, and by September, she had her first fiber tests back from the lab and had found 2 animals in her flock running below 19 microns. She called Amos and told him. He said, "Write it down." She did. You know this feeling. You have felt something like it, not necessarily with wool, not necessarily with livestock, but with something you built or kept or learned, quietly, over a long time, in the absence of external confirmation. The thing you kept because you knew what it was, even when the people around you graded it at the bottom of the scale. You know the patience that costs. You know the particular loneliness of correct knowledge that no one else is reading yet. You know the discipline of continuing to write it down anyway, to keep the ledger, to do the work carefully even when the pool price says you're wrong. And you know, maybe, the morning when someone with the right instruments finally looks. Tell us in the comments, what did you keep that others said wasn't worth keeping? What did you build that no one could see yet? We want to know. We read every comment, and these stories matter more when they belong to more than one person. If Amos's flock found something in you today, subscribe and hit the bell. We have more of these. The hop yard with the contract no one thought she'd read. The tractor that did 16 loads in standing water. The water right from 1887 that stopped a land speculator cold. We'll see you next week.